The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it's been a big week at the United Nations where the Chinese now have the rotating presidency of the Security Council. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Wednesday is leading a high-level talks over the Israel-Palestinian issue. This is rather unusual that a foreign minister leads these talks, but not unprecedented, certainly, but rather unusual. He is in New York this week to lead those discussions, really highlighting the shift that's happened over the past few weeks of Chinese diplomacy related to the Middle East from the region to the United Nations, especially in light of the fact that they have the rotating presidency. Last Friday, though, we had a rather interesting instance that occurred between Chinese Ambassador Zhang Jun and Israeli Ambassador Gilad Erdan, who last Friday again, when he began to criticize various UN agencies when the Israeli ambassador was commenting on a number of agencies, including UN Women. Let's take a listen to what transpired between these two, and then you're going to hear me translate Zhang's remarks.
Shame on you, UN Women. Shame on you. Is UN Women not charged with ensuring that, I quote from their website, all women and girls...
He says, distinguished representative of Israel, I would like to remind you that you can fully express your different opinions in your statement, but please show respect at least for the briefer invited to the meeting. This is the consistent practice of the Security Council and a rule that everyone should abide by. I would like to remind you to pay attention and please continue your speech. Cobus, that interaction generated a lot of buzz online. People saw it as a very unusual interaction. To be honest with you, and again, you and I are not experts in UN protocol, but I really can't remember a time when I've heard a UN president interrupt and berate like that, saying you must respect the briefers like that. I don't know. That caught me by surprise a little bit, but I think it speaks to the assertions now that China is making at the council. And I just thought that was very interesting.
It was interesting. You know, from having watched these kind of interactions over a while, it sounds like the mood in the Security Council room has been particularly tense for a while. There's been quite a few kind of fractures, back and forth, between members. I think the UN generally is very staid and protocol driven. So it's very interesting to see these interactions. But I think the mood around the Israel-Gaza conflict has been particularly, I think, tense in the UN. And, kind of the UN is kind of emerging, I think it's one of the few kind of global spaces which consistently deals with the Gaza crisis, and China as a leader in that space, so it's all very interesting to see.
Yeah, and there was another event that took place last week when a delegation of foreign ministers from the Organization of Islamic Countries and a number of other Arab states went to 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Councils to their capitals. And they started this world tour in China. And a lot of people took note of that. And it does, again, show the growing prominence that the Chinese are having on this issue, particularly aligned with Arab and Middle Eastern states on this issue. So again, lots is happening in this space. But the discussion that we're going to have today is the impact that the Israel-Gaza war is having on the broader global South, set against the backdrop of the great power competition between the United States and China. Now, as this war is moving into we're going into the 3rd month, so October 7th, November 7th, closing in on December 7th, and beginning the 3rd month, there is a growing sense that there's collateral damage for the United States and Europe and their standing in global South countries. Time magazine on their website had a headline that said, "The West is losing the global South over Gaza." Then Bloomberg opinion columnist Pankaj Mishra, he wrote in a really stinging column the other day, "The West never had a chance at winning over the world." And then he goes on to say, Biden's schemes involving Israel, Arab nations, and India are already in ruins. And he's, of course, referring to the India-Middle East corridor. The West's hopes of enlisting the global South in building a new global order are likely to join them. And then there was a segment on the BBC which caught a lot of people's attention. And again, the BBC in many ways is the ultimate media establishment in the West. And they kind of spelled it out that there's a lot at stake for the United States and Europe in this war.
There will come a time, and I think the Israelis are aware of this, when the diplomatic pressure from the West gets so strong that they have to respond to this. They have to respond to that, not just because of the sheer horror of the numbers of Palestinian deaths, but also because the West now is suffering too. Western allies are suffering a damage to their reputation in the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is saying, looking at Lord Cameron and they're looking at the Americans, they're saying there's a double standard here. You preach international law, and yet you ignore the criticisms that are made against Israel. You are saying civilians need to be defended in Ukraine, but they seem to be less well defended in Gaza. Those arguments are being made against the West now, and I think the West now is beginning to feel that, and that's why some of the language is beginning to be cranked up by people like Lord Cameron and other politicians who are visiting, saying to the Israelis, look, we're reaching a point where perhaps something needs to shift, but we're not there yet.
Cobus, nowhere is that sentiment more widespread than in South Africa, where this war is not only triggering traumas of colonialism, but also of the apartheid era.
Yes, I mean, the apartheid part of the Israel discussion, I think, is frequently a little vague, as if it simply means segregation. But, South Africa obviously has a strong, very strong awareness of what apartheid is, of course. And with that, South Africa also has a very long and complicated engagement with both Israel and Palestine. So South Africa has a very big Jewish community, and the attacks on October 7th really reverberated here and raised a lot of trauma. At the same time, apartheid South Africa had a very long working relationship with Israel, with the Mossad, for example, being instrumental in doing training and weapons programs and so on, with the apartheid government. And at the same time, the African National Congress and the anti-apartheid movement within South Africa also had a very strong connection with the Palestinian side. And there's, Nelson Mandela famously said that there will be no real global liberation without a liberation in Palestine. And there's also a big statue of Mandela in Ramallah. So there's this very strong, double historical connection. And so all of these discussions around Israel as an apartheid state or not an apartheid state has resonated very heavily in South Africa, particularly, I think, also because South Africans just have a much more concrete idea of what that would mean, and so it kind of resurrected a lot of discussions about, for example, the methods used by the apartheid state to control internal movements, of South Africans within South Africa, kind of where certain areas were no-go areas, you needed special permits to get into them. And those kind of measures have really, discussions around those issues have really been resurrected around all of the issues that are coming out of Israel at the moment.
And to link your assessment with what the BBC correspondent was saying was this idea that the United States, Joe Biden in particular, who provided unconditional support to the Israelis in this, there is a sentiment, a growing sentiment in a number of countries, including South Africa, that there is, again, a very stark double standard. As the BBC reporter mentioned, that when the Russians attacked civilians in Ukraine, the United States was decrying that. And yet when Israel clearly committed war crimes under the Geneva Conventions, that again is not a subjective statement. That is a fact-based statement that when you bomb civilians, it is a war crime. The justifications for it can be debated. The act cannot be debated. It is a war crime under international law. The United States has been quiet. And so there is this idea that the rules-based international order that the United States and Europe have been promoting for so long is not standing up to the challenge. All of this, of course, plays into China and Russia's hands, who have said that the Western-led international order does not align with the needs of the global South. So in this sense, Cobus, when we look at China's role in this, the best thing that they're doing right now in terms of strategy is staying quiet. Because when your enemy is shooting themselves in the foot, you don't want to intervene in any way. So one of the reasons why I'm thinking that the Chinese are not actually being more assertive on the Mideast issue is because the way this is unfolding and playing out seems to be playing into their narrative that the duplicity, hypocrisy of the rules-based international order, according to those in the global South, is now being called to account.
Yes, I tend to agree. Like at the beginning, people tended to take China's offer of mediating, the offer that came before October 7th, of possibly mediating in the Israel-Palestinian dispute. They took that as, in the first place, as a kind of a move to try and kind of step into a position traditionally occupied by the US. And what has happened, I think, subsequently to the attacks has been that China has actually not particularly kind of been interested in replicating any of those roles, but rather has been really focusing on positioning itself in relation to this issue in the wider global South. And the wider global South debate around this issue, I think, has been very damaging to any idea of to any kind of talking point of a rules-based international order. I think Israel and the crisis in Gaza, the full horror in Gaza, I think will be used as a kind of a somewhat whataboutist, maybe, kind of like rebuttal to the idea of a rules-based order for the next decade easily, I think, in the global South. I think that idea has really suffered a body blow, I think. And it's going to be quite hard, I think, for Western countries to present themselves as these kind of neutral arbiters of humanitarianism and morality, that idea that underlies the rules-based international order, that is there's a set of rules that apply to everyone. I think that's going to be a very tough argument to make for a while. And I think China's really leaning into that. I think that this has given China talking points for days, I think.
It's given an opening for the Chinese, and nowhere is this happening again more. And we said South Africa is one flashpoint, but whatever's happening in South Africa is happening in even more extreme sense in Muslim countries. And so let's get a perspective now from the world's largest Muslim country, Indonesia, where our Southeast Asia editor, Antonia Timmerman, is joining us on the show. Antonia, a very good afternoon. Great to have you back on the program.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon.
Antonia, you've been writing about the reaction to this war in Indonesia in particular. But before we get into that, I'd like to get your take on the BBC correspondent's assessment that there is going to be blowback for the U.S. and for Europe in their support of Israel. And that's going to be one of the consequences of this war.
I think that BBC commentary is very interesting. He said that the West now is suffering too, right? As in reputation damage. And I think he is right. Reputation-wise, definitely suffering in this part of the world. But it's not like a shocking thing. I don't think it's like a revelation, like a total revelation for people over here, because he's talking about double standards. And if we're talking about double standards, I think it's been known ever since the Iraq War and then Afghanistan. But then it happened over 20 years, right? And people forget. And it was kind of happening in the background. But I think now it's sort of like 20 years condensed into 6 weeks. And it's all over social media. So it's just that people are being reminded of those double standards in the clearest way, that you cannot dispute that there are double standards. And so I don't know how the West can come back from this, honestly, because he was also talking about the Ukraine war that's losing credibility. But also I'm saying it's not going to be only the US wars that's losing credibility, but a lot of Western-sponsored initiatives in human rights as well. For example, when you see the women's rights groups over here in Indonesia who are working with US donors, for example, they will say that how can you preach about women's rights and feminism while you are letting pregnant women in Gaza, for example, having C-sections without anesthetics? And, freedom of speech too. Like we're seeing people are getting fired for calling for a ceasefire. So it's not only the Ukraine war that's losing credibility, but all of these human rights values that the West are exporting and saying that these are universal values. And people are now seeing that these are not universal because now they're being applied selectively.
Antonia, so Cobus talked about the reaction in South Africa. The reaction in Indonesia has been equally passionate. Earlier this month, we saw hundreds of thousands of people across the country march in support of Palestinians. It was really remarkable, especially in this part of the world where it feels very far away, this war. You know, in Vietnam, in the daily newspapers, it's not on the front page that much. But clearly in Indonesia, this is touching a very sensitive nerve. Tell us a little bit about why Indonesians are responding the way they are to the war.
So the main reason why Indonesia is reacting very strongly about Palestine is that Indonesia will always see the Palestinians as a people being colonized, right? And as a country who was colonized before for centuries, of course, this is something that we will relate to the most. I wrote a column this week, comparing between the support for Palestine and also the support for the Uyghur and the Rohingya issue, which people say are pretty much muted. I would not say it that way, but because of this colonialism issue that is very important for Indonesians, that is why you see Indonesians reacting strongly for Palestine issue.
Can you kind of speak to this question of the colonialism parallel? Because I think the Israelis and the Americans would say there's no connection between European colonialism and what's going on in Israel today and the Israeli relationship. It may be a lot of things, but it's not colonial. That's what they would say, okay? I think they'd be adamant about that. But this war and the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians, in many people's perceptions in developing countries who themselves were victims of colonialism, see the parallel as clear as day.
So this is something that I see as well, that a lot of people in the West don't see this as colonialism. Well, for us, people in the global South or people who were colonized in the past, it's pretty clear-cut. Colonialism is a pretty easy thing to spot, right? So for us, when you take a piece of land and you use it for your own interest, whatever that is, without regards to the people who are already living there, that is colonialism. And so that is the only thing, the only problem that we see and that we have in our minds, right? So of course we do know about the backstory, but our sentiments that we have right now, it doesn't have anything to do with the backstory of why that happened, right? Because the people in the West will try to tell us, actually, this happened because we needed to create a safe space for the Jews. There were concerns of making a safe haven for the Jews and stuff like that. But people in the global South don't see it that way. So I'm seeing there's a disconnect. Many people in the West are seeing this as a continuation from the Second World War, right? Or maybe even before that, when the Jews were constantly repressed, discriminated against in Europe, and how that culminated in the Holocaust. And so Israel is really central to that story. But that is the story that much of the global South had no part in. We were kind of busy struggling for independence at the time. And from our perspective, the Jews were rejected by Europe, not by the global South. So that's why we have this mismatch of perspective.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think that colonialism may be too kind of like broad a term. I think what a lot of people specifically mean is settler colonialism. So where there's a large kind of like group of people, a large population of people that are transplanted to an area where they then take on the kind of identity as the natural citizens of that area. So this is like the way that Afrikaners were and kind of white people in general were taking on that position as the real population of South Africa, kind of through a long process of settling, and in the process of settling, driving the, kind of South Africans who were there before off their land. So kind of control of land, and in the process, a formation of a kind of an indigenous identity that displaces earlier identities as part of also displacing earlier claims on land. That process has been seen in South Africa, arguably has been seen in Israel, and, it's obviously has been a dominant kind of process in the United States and in Canada and in Australia and other settler colonial societies as well. So in that sense, I think, like there are obviously, as Antonia was mentioning, there are all of these historical complications, and, kind of, and one can get very deep into the weeds, obviously, in Israeli history, and there's very valid kind of claims and counterclaims in all directions. But the kind of process of post-1948 kind of displacement of internal populations, and particularly the creation of the Palestinian territories as they evolved over time has parallels to, kind of the situation in South Africa in the past, where all of these entities were created, these kind of like micro-states or other kind of governance entities were created within the country. And then, kind of citizenship laws were kind of used to position certain people as citizens or natural kind of occupiers of certain parts of the countries and others of other parts of the country. So, so all of that, I think global South populations, I think, see very, very powerful parallels, I think, between that and the colonial experience.
I suspect that some of our listeners are probably wondering, that we've lost the script here, and what does this have to do with China? And the fact is, though, is that colonialism is very much a part of the Chinese narrative. The century of humiliation, which is framed by colonialism, still lives very close to the surface in Chinese politics. It is a key theme of President Xi Jinping's diplomacy. This giant chip on their shoulder about colonialism very much informs their interactions and their discourse with countries in Africa, in Asia. And for those of us who follow these conversations quite closely, the Chinese are explicit in saying that we were the victims of the same colonial imperialists that you were when they talked to Africans and Latin Americans and Asians as well. And so all of this framework that Antonia and Cobus are putting together in terms of why people are so sensitive and why this war that's triggering traumas about colonialism and apartheid is resonating so much in developing countries that themselves were colonized by Western countries. And they're transferring that anger to the US and Europe. And the Chinese very much are aligned with that. And I think it plays very much in the geopolitical struggle between the United States, Europe, and China, very much to China's advantage. Antonia, you talked about double standards. And I think that's a very interesting conversation to have, because one of the things that caught my attention after those massive protests, and you and I had a number of conversations about this, was the way that Indonesians, who, again, see themselves as, in many ways, a leader, if not the leader of the Islamic world, given the fact that they are the largest Muslim country in the world, in many ways are very selective where their outrage is. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Rohingya Muslims, they're refugees from Myanmar. They were pushed out of Myanmar into Bangladesh. And starting in mid-November, thousands started to flee Bangladesh and started to wash ashore in Indonesia. Let's take a listen to some of the background from a report in Aceh, Indonesia, from Deutsche Welle.
Until now, the people of Aceh have mostly welcomed Rohingya refugees. But recently, the number of arrivals has risen dramatically, increasing tensions in the region. This boat at Biren Beach, carrying hundreds of migrants, was pushed back to sea twice before finally being allowed to land after a third attempt.
Yes, I hope they go back to their own country. I don't want them to move to other parts of Aceh. We hope the local government or central government can guard the sea so that the Rohingya that want to enter Aceh are not left unescorted.
Antonia, it was quite striking that villagers in Aceh went out to some of the initial boats. Some of them were armed, forced the Rohingya back onto the boats. Many did land ashore. But it got me thinking, and again, this was a conversation that you and I had. Again, I'm not as well versed in this as you are, about what seems to be an inconsistency in terms of concern about Muslim injustice, whereas the Palestinian issue generates enormous support among the Indonesian public. The Rohingya issue has not, as has the Uyghur issue. And so it just prompted this conversation that you and I had about that. You then went off to do a fantastic report called Explaining Indonesia's Different Responses to Palestine, Xinjiang, and Myanmar's Rohingya. And you had a chance to speak with a number of experts in Indonesia to try and better understand what appears to be different standards, if not double standards, in Indonesians' concerns for the plight of Muslims in different countries. Tell us a little bit about the reporting that you did and what you found.
So we were all very shocked to see the news about how Indonesians in Aceh sent a boat full of Rohingyas back to the sea. And as you mentioned, this comes at a time where support for Palestine is at all-time high, right? So the contradiction there is very, very stark. As I mentioned in my column, though, upon closer look, I don't think it is accurate to say that Indonesia does not support Rohingya or the Uyghurs for that matter. But I'm going to talk specifically about the Rohingya first. So first on the regional level, on the diplomatic level, the experts that I talked to told me that Indonesia has actually voiced support for the Rohingyas and even leading the conversations about the subject. And for the matter of Rohingyas refugees, Indonesia has accepted thousands since 2009. And I also talked to people on the ground, activist coordinators who are in Aceh right now, handling the arrivals. And they told me that really it comes down to the problem of refugee management that leads to these social problems that we heard just now and social friction with the local communities. Can you imagine when you have overcrowded camps, right? And then you have to live next to a population that is very, very repressed and very restricted as a refugee, and they are very desperate, and you have to deal with this for years since 2009. Of course, you will have a problem. So it's not a problem of sheer cruelty out of nowhere, but I see it as a social friction that arises because of this capacity problem. You know, the experts that handling the refugees, again, they're calling to the West or developed countries to do their share of responsibility by taking in the refugees, for example, or by preventing the wars from happening in the first place. Yes, we're talking about Rohingya refugees, but also we have so many refugees from Afghanistan as well, and it's straining our resources. So this is all interconnected. When you have so many wars, of course, you will have so many displacement, so many people will become refugees. And when many of these wars are sponsored by the West, of course, the global South countries will be like, well, you know, you're creating a chain of problems here. Can you please help us to deal with it?
Cobus, it really does seem like what Antonia is saying is very similar to the events that have been unfolding at Lampedusa in Greece and along the U.S.-Mexico border, where they're also seeing record amounts of refugee flows coming into those different regions as well. So this may not have anything to do. In fact, it is, according to the reporting that Antonia is doing, has nothing to do with Muslim solidarity, but has more to do with the fact that it's a refugee crisis.
Yes, you know, increasingly we see the issue of the borderline and people trying to get across is, you know, is emerging as one of the biggest crises of our century. And certainly it shows up in other parts of the global south, even though the kind of global focus tends to fall on the borders of Europe and the US. In reality, the vast majority of displaced people tend to move to other global south countries from the global south countries rather than to the global north. And so these countries obviously don't have a lot of resources to deal even with their own population. And so this does kind of add a lot of pressure. It then also lands in a wider conversation about South-South solidarity and what that means and non-polarity and so forth and so forth. In a moment of greater international resentment about Western, you know, privilege, these conversations then end up being very complicated and fraught. So Antonia, just relating to this wider conversation, I was wondering, you know, obviously Indonesia has a very strong history of being an anti-colonial power. And the 1955 Bandung Conference between Africa and Asia, for example, which had a very strong kind of anti-colonial tenor, what took place in Bandung in Indonesia. So I was wondering what Indonesians think about China's positioning as a big leader of the global south and as a, you know, kind of as a big anti-colonial voice. Like whether China's getting some sympathy in Indonesia for that or whether people are like, China doesn't know what they're talking about.
So I was reading this interesting SCMP article this morning that Eric gave me. And one of the questions that the article poses is that whether China can mobilize the global south, right, to follow the policy of calling for a ceasefire. So similar to your question. So I look at that article and I'm reading that. And the first thing that comes to mind is that the article is right. The global south is very diverse. It's a term given by academics for developing countries who were colonized in the past. So it's not a bloc with a leader. And so now if there is a question whether China is sort of, quote unquote, the leader of global South, and in this specific case, calling for a ceasefire, I don't think so. I don't think so. If there seems to be a unified calling for ceasefire now, or more broadly in general, if the global South countries seem to be united right now, I don't think it's because of the leadership of China or mobilization by China or from anyone. I think because these global South countries, the term, right, it comes very spontaneously from a shared feeling that some of us are second-class citizens in the world and that some lives are cheaper than the other. So it's really pretty spontaneous for me. So I don't think the global South countries need much coordination or mobilization in that front. It's very rare for Indonesia, for example, to think of itself as part of the global South. So it's only in the rare events like this where people are reminded of their position in the world that then they will freely use the term global South and talk about global South unity, etc. But still seeing China as a force that is separated from that.
So in your report, you also had a chance to talk to various analysts, both about the Rohingya and about the Uyghurs. And while the Rohingya, as you pointed out, is more of a refugee crisis than anything else, the question of the Uyghurs comes up as well, given the fact that Indonesians are oftentimes very insensitive to Muslim injustice. There are well-documented human rights violations in many parts of Xinjiang. That's as far as I'll go on that, in part because the evidence is there for people to see. And, in terms of what that means. But yet it does not resonate as an issue in Indonesia at all. And it raises the question as to why. And interestingly, the analyst that you spoke to said ignorance came up as the main reason. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So ignorance is definitely a big reason. Personally, I was only exposed to the Uyghur and Rohingya issues when I started working as a journalist 10 years ago. Whereas Palestine, for example, as a little kid, I would see people rallying in the streets with Palestinian flags. So it's definitely the amount of information that is available to people makes so much difference.
I think this is also true, I think, in South Africa. The awareness, the trans-historical awareness of the Palestine-Israel issue is just so much bigger, I think, in South Africa. Whereas, even people who are interested in China don't necessarily follow the Uyghur kind of discussion in South Africa. So I think, it's true as well. I think, Israel-Palestine is kind of unique, I think, in terms of the amount of attention I think it draws internationally.
It's interesting because I was speaking to a researcher last week who was asking me about Uyghur issues, and I brought this question up about the fact that there's just very little awareness. And they were very surprised to hear that because in the US and Europe, there's a lot of discussion about the Uyghurs. And of course, the verdict is already made in the body politic that whatever's happening in Xinjiang is horrific. And there's this kind of disconnect between their world of talking about it incessantly, and then many parts of the world like South Africa, Indonesia, and most countries which don't talk about it at all. And there's also this inconsistency that they seem to not understand. Why do Muslim leaders, and Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, came back from Beijing a couple of months ago, very, very much touting the Chinese line on Xinjiang. And again, they don't understand the geopolitical calculations that are being made as well by Arab and Muslim leaders not to raise their voices in an alignment with the West. Cobus, it's a very complicated issue. And again, it's not one that we fully understand either. But what we have heard over and over again is that whatever's happening in Xinjiang is just not the problem for many people in the global South. And in fact, I was talking to Giraud, our colleague who's from the Congo, and he said where he comes from in the DRC, concerns about human rights violations in other parts of the world just are not paramount in countries that have their own human rights challenges like they do in the DRC. So again, when the United States and Europe continually talk about Xinjiang as part of their conversation about China in the global South, trying to persuade countries to sign on to these UN statements, and literally The U.S. has been 0 for 50, I think, in terms of persuading African, Asian, and Latin American countries to join them in these statements at the UN Human Rights Council, in part because a lot of these countries just don't see this as their struggle. It's a very, very complex issue. But Cobus, let's get your final thoughts on this.
It is really complex. I think a lot of Global South leaders tend to write it off as an internal domestic dispute, that doesn't have an international kind of resonance, which obviously is very self-serving, but it also filters into anxieties around separatism that is in a lot of kind of countries in the Global South. A lot of them are dealing with separatist movements themselves, and so it's easy for them to kind of shuffle the Uyghurs into that category as well, which is obviously a talking point that China itself is pushing. I think in some ways the Uyghur issue is quite a fundamental challenge to China's position as a leader of the Global South, which became clear to me a few weeks ago. There was this very interesting, quite revealing meme that was circulated on Chinese social media, which was essentially showing a picture of Xinjiang looking orderly and prosperous, and then a picture of Gaza looking destroyed. And essentially, kind of the implication being that China has found some kind of magic bullet in dealing with, quote unquote, handling, kind of small domestic Muslim minorities, which I think was quite interesting to circulate as China was also trying to position itself with the Global South, because obviously the implication of the meme positions China in the position of Israel, rather than as in the position of the Palestinians. So that I thought was a very interesting little Freudian slip, kind of coming out of China, kind of in terms of how the situation is viewed.
You may be misreading that, if I can. That the message coming out of China is that they have been able to successfully contain Muslim extremism. They have not had an attack in 5 years. That is one of the main talking points about Xinjiang in places like Egypt and Nigeria in particular, where they get a lot of traction. You talk to a lot of Nigerians and you say China has been able to contain Muslim extremism, and their eyebrows pop up and they say, really? How? Because we've been fighting Boko Haram now for more than a decade, and it's not made the progress that they want. Clearly, President al-Sisi in Egypt has been opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. He really resonates with the idea of fighting Muslim extremism. Again, we're not taking sides in all of this, but this is just that message does resonate in a place like Cairo. And so I think that message too that you were seeing was China's been able to contain Muslim extremism. And that is an appealing message in many countries where Islamic radicalism is a problem. Here in Asia, we have the same challenge in southern Thailand and the southern Philippines as well. And I think that message of what China's been able to do in Xinjiang, the way they present it, is appealing for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that is true. It does appeal to a lot of people. But what is interesting for me is that there are kind of parallels to be drawn between Xinjiang and Gaza, kind of in the respect of different forms of settler colonialism. So in that sense, this is a very kind of complicated situation, and there's no winning, right? Kind of there's no kind of clear kind of untainted position frequently in the discussion. But I think in a moment when China is really working very hard to present itself as being in some kind of solidarity with the population of Gaza, this was quite revealing in positioning it as an external power handling and containing a Muslim population, rather than working with them or engaging with them in any particular way, right? So in that sense, that positionality I thought was interesting and revealing.
Antonia, we're going to give you the last word in this discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. What do you want people to take away from what you're seeing in Indonesia and what we've talked about today in what is incredibly sensitive, incredibly difficult? I don't think there's any way we're going to escape this conversation, by the way, without offending somebody. That's not our intent. We're really genuinely trying to just lay out what are incredibly complex issues. But what do you want people to walk away from this conversation with?
So I've been thinking a lot about this, and the main point that I will say right now is I think the West and the Global South have two very different ways of looking at Palestine and Israel issue, mainly. And for the conversation to move forward, I think it depends largely on whether or not the West is willing to listen to the Global South. And yeah, I think the onus is on them to listen what we've been saying and our perspectives.
Antonia Timmerman is CGSP's Southeast Asia editor based in Jakarta, close by me here in Vietnam. And her amazing article, which I encourage you to check out, explaining Indonesia's different responses to Palestine, Xinjiang, and Myanmar's Rohingya. That article is for our subscribers. And that's the kind of quality content and analysis that you will get as a subscriber to the China Global South Project. We're so proud of the work that we're doing every day in terms of the analysis of what's happening in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central Asia, and around the war in Gaza. These very complex issues that you just don't see a lot of other people tackling in real time the way we're trying to do it. So if you'd like to join our growing community of readers, please go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We'll give you 30 days free just to try it out. If you have any questions whatsoever, or if you are a student or teacher, you can email me directly, Eric, E-R-I-C, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. I'll send you links for 50% discounts to our service. We're launching a new research hub. We're launching a new video service for our subscribers. We've got a chat bot that was designed in part because of a lot of AI bias that exists on ChatGPT and Bard when it comes to China. And so our chatbot is a closed network, large language model that does generative AI, but it only draws from the 5,000 or 6,000 articles in our database, our transcripts from our podcasts from various experts. So you're going to get a much more nuanced perspective on China than you will get in the standard ChatGPT or Google Bard services. Cobus, Antonia, thank you so much for joining us. We will all be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.